the video. I'm trying to decide whether to go back and start recording in advance or not. I haven't done that. Right now, we're just relying on the recordings that are being done in the class. So trying to give you as many options as possible. I did get the good news this morning, though. We are getting a center screen over there. So we'll have a big screen, not just those two side screens. So, yay. All right. Now then, I've got to get up here and find this little thing and click it off since he's telling me that it's recording. And there we go. I'll bring this back over here and I'll ask you guys the question. What's the most interesting thing you heard in today's sermon? Wasn't that a good sermon? Yes. It was. It was great. Okay.
CPR.
CPR. Wasn't that good?
Yeah, I love it.
And doesn't that fit?
Sort of fit.
You know, we would like to give CPR to people, but the problem is right now we don't need as much of that CPR because those are the things that just seem to be the hot buttons. Okay. Anything else that you heard that was particularly helpful?
Who's my Nineveh?
Who's my Nineveh? You know, I've always said, no, Jonah is the most successful preacher ever. I mean, Billy Graham doesn't stack up to him. And yet, like Kim pointed out, that's the worst sermon possible. And the worst sermon had the best results. That whole nation of Assyria is spared 150 years because of that sermon. Now, if you were a resident of Israel at that time, that's not good news. Because what's going to happen in that 150 years is Assyria is going to come and wipe you out. Which is why Jonah wasn't too keen on evangelizing Nineveh. Okay. All right. Anything else? I'm sorry? Listen. I don't have this on my computer at the office. I probably should. But I have a friend who was a bench officer along with me who had that passage from James, except he worded it this way. His screensaver said, be quick to hear, slow to speak, never to anger. Mike McCoy. Okay. Anybody else?
I have one more that I liked.
Okay.
When Kim said Christianity is a heart transplant, not behavior modification.
It's a heart transplant. You're right. It's right. All right. Here are some things I picked up. I love the illustration. Anger is like the tip of an iceberg because it masks a larger heart issue hidden beneath the surface. You know, the Titanic wouldn't have sunk if it hadn't hit the part of the iceberg that was under the surface, right? That's what took it down, okay? And this is a pacemaker, not a heart transplant. We are all works in progress. God wants to change our hearts. I took the pacemaker idea. I like Kim's idea of a heart transplant better, but I couldn't find a transplanted heart. I found a pacemaker. Okay. The most common triggers for setting conversational fires in 2021 are CPR, COVID, political idolatry, and racial hostility. That's great. I love that. Anger and bitterness hurt my witness to an unbelieving world. And they really do. Okay. And I love that quote. The book of Jonah shows you that you can do what God wants you to do, or you can do what God wants you to do covered in fish puke. You're going to do it one way or the other, right? You know, I love that. All right. Wish I thought of it. And of course, Chuck Swindoll, I'm convinced that life is 10% what happens to me, 90% how I react to it. And so his 6 steps of things that we need to do: spend less time on the things that distress us and more time with the Lord, seek to understand other people's points of view, listen more than we speak, restart conversations with people that we don't have conversations with anymore, gather with people who have the same issues. You know, that's good. And then confess our anger and ask the Lord for help. Those are 6 steps that he mentioned, and I thought those were really good. So I appreciate your input on that. All right. Now, like I said, the city of Dan today and the city of Caesarea Philippi next week come from 2 points of the biblical story, But they both have a common message. The more I thought about it, the more I thought they both have a common message because they're both centers of idolatry. And that's what we're going to see as we take a look at them. Now then, if you look at a map, you'll see above the Sea of Galilee, the headwaters of the Jordan come down through Lake Eula. You can see Lake Eula. Okay, there it is right there. You can see Lake Eula right there. And if you come up above Lake Eula, you'll see Dan and Caesarea Philippi, both at the base of Mount Hermon, which is the highest peak in Israel. Now, Dan figures into the Old Testament narrative. Caesarea Philippi figures into the gospel narrative. All right. And so that's why if you're looking at an atlas, you won't see both of them on the same map. I put them there so you can see how they are. We'll literally go from Dan to Caesarea Philippi. And I think the message is essentially the same. But at this point, last week we talked about Nazareth, right? We talked about Nazareth last week. But between the story about Nazareth, Jesus growing up there, and him winding up in Caesarea Philippi, he never went to Dan. He's moved to Capernaum. We'll talk about it in a couple of weeks. And we'll talk about Capernaum, Chorazin, and Bethsaida. But then Caesarea Philippi, he goes to at the very end of the ministry, just before heading down to Jerusalem. But we'll talk about that next week. All right. This is the entrance to Tel Dan. Tel, remember, is a Hebrew word for a mound. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Hey, feel free. Feel free. It's a mound. It's a hill. And typically you'll see a lot of these in Israel where literally civilization's been built on top of civilizations. And so the archaeologists go and dig down and they find out what the more recent civilizations look like. And then they go back and more remote. In Megiddo, you may remember, they found 26 layers of civilization that literally have been built on top of one another. And the reason is because they're not like us. They're not spread out over 3,000 miles across. You know, they're just the size of New Jersey. And so everything's built on top of everything else. Well, there's Tel Dan. And the excavation at Dan has been the most extensive excavation over a longest period of time in Israel. The excavation started back in about 1970s, as I recall. I think I've got the date written down here in a little bit. But anyway, it's an interesting place and you'll really enjoy it. This is the Dan Spring. How many of you thought Israel looked like this? This is the spring. It comes from Mount Hermon. It's the Dan Spring is the largest of four springs that lead into the Jordan headwaters. And when they get together, there's what they look like. The headwaters of the Jordan River. And this is the way they look at Dan. And there are actually four streams that come together there. And the biggest one is the one at Dan. The next one is the one that comes out of Caesarea Philippi. It's called the Banias Spring. And that's the modern name of Caesarea Philippi. And then the other two are called the Eon and the Hispanic Springs. And they drain about 10,042 square miles. And they go year round because it's an aquifer that's fed by the melting snows from Mount Hermon. And so they flow year round. This is a trail right by Dan. I mean, this is the way that part of Israel looks. It's gorgeous. When we go to Dan and Caesarea Philippi, you can understand why people want to be there because it's just a gorgeous place to be. Now, where does it fit in the biblical story? Dan fits in primarily in the books of Judges and Kings, but the first reference to Dan actually comes in the book of Genesis. If you remember the story of Genesis, back in Genesis 14, something happened. You may remember in Genesis 14, beginning with verse 1, you read this. In the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, these kings made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Beersheba, king of, go back and find it again. Okay. Beersheba, king of, there it is, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. And we're going, all right, right? Okay, let me tell you what you're talking about. The text says 4 Kings verses 5, and that's what it is. Now, notice the green line there. Notice that green line that starts down here at where Abraham comes from. This is the same path that Abraham traveled to come into Israel, to Canaan, the promised land, right? It's the same path. This is the same path every invader ever took coming from the Middle East over toward Israel. Whether it came from Assyria, whether they came from Babylon, they always traveled this path. Why did they always travel that path? Yeah, they're following rivers because what they got here is 400 miles of desert, right? In fact, the first military leader that's recorded as going across that desert was Alexander the Great, you know. But anyway, that's what's going on. Now, these guys, Amraphel, king of Shinar. Shinar is located in Babylon. That's the area of Babylon right there. Okay, Arioch, king of Elasar. Elasar is a little down closer to where was, Abraham's point of origin. Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, that's Persia. And then Title. Now, notice this says Title, king of nations. If you're reading your Bible, it probably is going to say Title, king of Goyim, okay? Title, king of Goyim. And most of the translations do. I looked it up this morning. Most of them do. I only found one modern translation that doesn't translate Goyim. Goyim is really a transliteration. You know what a transliteration is? That's where they take a word that we really don't know what it means, or maybe we do, and they just transliterate it letter for letter rather than translating it. Our word baptize is a transliteration. The Greek word baptizo. The word didn't exist. The reason we have baptize in our translations is because by the time English translations were being made, a number of people had begun substituting sprinkling for immersion, and the word baptizo means immerse. Okay, so if the guy who's funding your translation was sprinkled and you translate immerse, that might get you in political hot water. CPR, right? Okay. So instead of translating it, they transliterated it. But baptizo means immerse. That's all it ever meant. Never meant anything else. Okay. So anyway, that's the same type of thing you've got here. So I obviously pushed the button when I didn't intend to. Okay. So anyway, you've got those four kings. Now, when I was growing up, Amraphel was identified as Hammurabi. He was not Hammurabi. This is a couple of hundred years before Hammurabi. Sorry, Dad. Dad's the one that told me that. But anyway, he changed his mind now. He was really good at that. Even to the end of his days, he was always learning new things and revising the things he knew. Now, but title. Notice here it says title, King of Nations, right here, down on number 4. And that's because what is the Hebrew word for a non-Jew? Goy. A goy. And to make something plural in Hebrew, you don't add an S like we do in English. You add an IM. Goyim means Gentiles or nations. That's what it means. Just like I told you, the Greek word ethnos is the word that's translated sometimes Gentiles, sometimes nations. It has to do with non-Jews, okay? So really the Net Bible does a good job on this one because it translates it title, King of Nations. Now, the interesting thing is we may not be able to identify these particular kings, but we can identify where they come from because the wording that describes these kings is the wording that's familiar from historical records. For example, the name Arioch. That was a common name among Mesopotamian rulers. Just like, you might have Ptolemy or Seleucus or things like that, or Antiochus, things like that. There are certain names that are common among rulers as throne names. Kedorlaomer is a name that's common for Mesopotamia, and it has to do with servant of Lagamar, an Elamite goddess who's Persian. Okay, so in other words, we can identify the names and say, okay, this would be what a king in Persia would have been called. This is what a king in this particular area would be called. When you get to title, title is actually a name that was the name of 5 Hittite kings. Tudkala is the way it was worded by the Hittites. Why is that important? I think you may remember that I told you when we first started this study that 100 years ago, naysayers were saying, the Bible's just full of hooey. It makes up a bunch of stuff. We never heard of any such group as Hittites, right? Never heard of them. Haven't found any archaeological evidence of them. Then 100 years ago, guess what they found? They found the Hittites. And today we know that the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age coincided with the collapse of the Hittite Empire. So this is an empire that we found that 100 years ago they didn't know existed. Well, 120 years ago, they didn't know existed, okay? So title King of Nations is a Hittite king. He's probably the more prominent king in this whole bunch because just like later on, you've got the Assyrian Empire, you've got the Babylonian Empire, you've got the Hittite Empire. And so he's probably the ringleader of this batch, and that's why he's listed last, because he's the heavyweight, okay? So these guys come around the Fertile Crescent, and they pick up more support, and they're headed down to find this bunch of people that thought that because they were across 400 miles of desert, they could get away with rebelling against Chedorlaomer. Guess what? They got another thing coming. So these guys come down, and they come down and have a fight with these kings around the Salt Sea, the Dead Sea, Sodom, Gomorrah, Zeboim, those places. And they chase them all the way down to the Gulf of Aqaba, whip them, and then start back up. So now you're looking at something like this. They come all the way down to the Gulf of Aqaba, and then they start back up. And by now, Abraham has heard about what happened. So in Genesis 14, what does Abraham do? He gets 318 commandos, and he chases them, to a place that in the Bible is identified as Dan. And there he splits his troops up, and those 318 send these 4 kings and their armies packing, headed back toward Damascus. Okay, and here's the text, Genesis 14, verses 14 to 16. When Abram heard that his kinsman Lot had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions and brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions and the women and the people. So he goes and chases this group of armies all the way back to, it's not enough to beat them, not enough to whip them. He chases them. 318 men. Abraham was one tough hombre. Okay. And anyway, so that's the first time you read about Dan in the Old Testament. Now, here's the problem. Who wrote the book of Genesis? Moses. In the day of Moses, Dan was not called Dan. It was called Laish. I'll show you that in a minute. So how does it come to be called Dan in the book of Genesis if it wasn't called Dan then? Here's the simple answer. And this is something we need to understand. In translating scriptures, a lot of times it's important to bring in names that people are familiar with. In the days after Moses and after the book of Judges, nobody would have known Laish, but they would have known Dan. And so they just gave a summary there. This is Dan. That's the place we're talking about. How do we know it used to be called Laish? Well, we know, incidentally, this is a fascinating thing that you'll see at Dan. There are 3 big things you're going to see at Dan. This is one of them. This is a Middle Bronze mud brick gate that's contemporary with Abraham. It's quite possible that Abraham saw that gate when he went to Dan. Okay, in fact, when I was there before, they called it Abraham's Gate. They don't call it that anymore. But anyway, it's a Middle Bronze mud brick gate that would be contemporary with the collapse of the Hittite Empire and the time of Abraham. All right. And closer up views of it as you look at it and the entrance into it. This is probably the way it looked when it was originally constructed around 2000 BC, something like that. Okay, so that is the mud brick gate we'll see at Tel Dan.
Are they still digging? Are they?
Oh yeah, they're digging all the time.
So they haven't quit.
Oh no. In fact, the interesting thing is that we're going to see in a 50-acre lot, which is what Dan is, about 50 acres. It is a circle. In this 50 acres, they've got like 3 sections that they pretty fully excavated. But all throughout Israel, they're constantly excavating stuff.
And who are the people that are doing this? Are they all from all over the world?
All over the world. They're archaeologists. Some have a biblical perspective. Some don't have a biblical perspective. They're just archaeologists over there digging. They come from various universities that go over there, and every year a different group comes over and digs in these different locations. So that's it right there. Now then, that's Genesis. Now we come to the book of Judges. This is where the story of Dan kind of comes into play here. I'm sorry? Oh, I thought so. So Dan, in Judges 18 is the story of Dan. And it's really not a very favorable story for the people of Dan. It's the migration of Dan. Now remember, when the people went into the land, they were given a charge. And that charge was to kick everybody out, right? And Judges chapter 1 says they didn't do it. And it says the reason they didn't. And the reason is there's too much work. That's what it amounts to. It's too much work, and so they didn't. So what happens in Judges chapter 2? God says, okay, told you to do it. You didn't do it. Now they're going to be a snare for you, right? They're going to be a constant source of temptation for you. And that's exactly what the book of Judges is all about. They didn't do. Now, so the people of Dan come along in Judges 18 and say, well, these Canaanites, well, they don't want to leave. They're too big for us. They're too mean for us. They got these iron chariots. They're too hard for us to kick out. Now, what do you know about when God tells you to do something? He makes a way. Exactly. If God tells me to jump through that wall, my job is to jump. God's going to have to take care of the wall. Right? And that's the way it is. But the Israelites never got that through their heads. Let's be honest. Would we have been any different? Absolutely not. The message of the Old Testament is we're all just like them. Okay? We do the same thing. Okay. So the people of Dan say it's too hard. We don't want to do this. Even though the territory they were given was really, really beautiful territory. It was flat, fertile territory right at the southern end of the plain of Sharon. And it was very fertile. And you have the Mediterranean Sea over here, and you've got the low-lying hills leading up to the spiny mountain range. It's great territory. It's right on that way of the sea, the Via Maris that I've been telling you about. I mean, you couldn't ask for a better place to be, but it's too hard. So what they decide to do is they send some people scouting for another homeland. They're not satisfied with the one God gave them. They want another one. So they send 5 guys out from their territory, and those 5 guys come up here near Shiloh, and they find a guy named Micah, who has his own private prophet. He's a Levite, preacher for a family, and they say to him, is the Lord going to bless our journey as we look for a new homeland? Go for it. The Lord's going to give you what you want. The only problem is he never went and asked the Lord. Okay. It's one of these preachers that will tell you whatever you want to hear. Have you ever seen a preacher like that? What do you want to hear? That's what I'll preach. Okay. And that's the way he does. So they go up and they scout on up above all of the other territories, and they come to this place called Laish, and they say, this is it. It's gorgeous. And I showed you pictures of it. It's gorgeous, right? And they say, this is the place. And not only is it a great place, but it's got a lot going for it because it's got mountains all around it. So it would take people from Tyre and Sidon over here too long to get here to help them. It would take people from Damascus too long to get over here to help them. There's nobody around who's going to be able to help them. And so we can take this city pretty easily. And they run back to their people down in the south, and they say, we found a perfect place, just get us an army together and let's go whoop them. And so they get 600 men and head up. Now, on the way up there, they stop back at this place where Micah is, and they pick up this priest and they say, hey, you want to preach for a bigger church? What they say to him is, wouldn't you rather preach for a whole nation, a whole tribe, than for a family? Well, sounds pretty good. So he packs up and goes. Not only does he pack up and go, but he takes Micah's idols. Micah has idols. And he takes Micah's idols with him. Now, what should the people of Dan done? What should they have done? Huh? They should have stoned the priests. They should have destroyed the idols. In fact, before that, they should have taken the land God gave them. Right? I mean, how many ways can you possibly go wrong? And these guys are doing every one of them. Just pick out all the bad things you can do and check a box off, and they did it all. Okay? So they grab this guy. Mike comes out and he says, hey, what gives? You stole my preacher and my gods. And they said, this could come right out of a modern crime television show. You got two choices. You can go home without your preacher and your gods, or you can die. Those are your choices. So the guy goes home, right? So they take the priest and they go up to Laish, and they take Laish and they take it. And here's what the text says. The people of Dan took what Micah had made and the priest who belonged to him, and they came to Laish, to a people quiet and unsuspecting, and struck them with the edge of the sword and burned the city with fire. And there was no deliverer because it was far from Sidon, and they had no dealings with anyone. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rehob, and they built a city and lived in it, and they named the city Dan after the name of Dan, their ancestor, who was born to Israel, but the name of the city was Laish at the first. So this is how we know that when Abraham was around, the name of the city was Laish. Okay. Now they call it Dan. So the book of Genesis, in order to make sure people understand what we're talking about, puts Dan there. Okay, that's not a problem. All right, so that's what they do. Well, what do you suppose they're going to do with that priest and that idol, those idols that they've got? Who do you think delivered Dan into their hands? That priest and those idols. So they start a history of idolatry there. It was already an idolatrous place. The area there at south of Mount Hermon, that area is known in Canaanite times as a hotbed of Baal worship. Okay, so there's the next place you see it. Now, periodically in the Bible, you'll read references like this. Judges 20 verse 1 or 1 Samuel 3 verse 20, where we talk about all Israel from Dan to Beersheba. Have you ever heard that statement? All Israel from Dan to Beersheba? From Dan to Beersheba. And what they're talking about is basically, in order to describe the Israelite territory, they'll say everything from the northernmost town, which is Dan, all the way down to the south in Beersheba. That's a description for all of Israel. That's just the way they describe it, okay? And so that's what's going on there. Now then, fast forward a few hundred years. Now we've gone from Abraham in about 2000 BC to the book of Judges, about 1400 BC. Now we're coming down to the time of the divided kingdom around 900 BC, something like that. Okay? And hang on a second here. There we go. And what happens here is, do you recall when Solomon died, he was succeeded by a son named, anybody remember? Rehoboam, okay. And what happened in the days of Rehoboam? There was a civil war and the kingdom split. Now that was what God had said was going to happen to Solomon, but he didn't do it in Solomon's day out of respect for David. He did it in Rehoboam's day, and Rehoboam probably could have avoided it if he had a little sense. You know, the people come and they say, you know, your dad really worked us hard. We really like you let off a little bit. And then he says, you know, real encouraging words. Like, my little finger is thicker than my father's thigh, okay. And so that's really encouraging to people. So they lead this civil war. And Jeroboam, who had been one of Solomon's officials, takes 10 of the tribes and goes off and starts the northern kingdom, which is called Israel. So for the period of the kings, you've got Israel in the north, you've got Judah in the south, and that's the way the two kings were described. So anyway, what does Jeroboam do? Well, Jeroboam gets the idea that he's got to separate the people from the religion, because there were certain expectations. It was expected that every Jewish male would go back to Jerusalem 4 times a year, right? For special feasts. They're supposed to go back to Jerusalem. And Jeroboam gets to thinking, if they keep going back to Jerusalem, it won't be long before they decide, well, they'll forget that what caused this rift, and they'll just kind of become a part of that one kingdom again. So what he does is he builds an altar up in the north at Dan, and then he builds an altar down in the south at Bethel. And this is what you read, 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 28 to 30. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold, and he said to the people, "You've gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods." Incidentally, notice you've gone up to Jerusalem. Well, wait a minute. Jerusalem's south, right? Why does it say gone up to Jerusalem? Elevation. We're really the first people who have really thought of north as being up and south as being down. In fact, maps centuries ago were not oriented north and south. They were oriented east and west. Where does the word orient come from? East, right? They were oriented east, okay? And so, we tend to read the Bible with our own preconceptions, and we really shouldn't. Okay, so you've gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Even though the Made in China tag is still on them. And he set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. Then this thing became a sin, for the people went as far as Dan to be before one. So this is where you have the altars. And every Israelite king after Jeroboam, you read something like this about him. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the way of Jeroboam and in his sin, which he made Israel to sin. He walked in the way of Jeroboam, did the same things Jeroboam did. Now you read that about all the kings except 2. Those 2 are Omri and his son Ahab. And of those 2, it says it wasn't bad enough for them to walk in this ways of the sin of Jeroboam. They had to do things that were worse. Okay? But everybody else, they walked like Jeroboam. They did like Jeroboam. They did like Jeroboam. Okay? So what Jeroboam does is he, in order to keep political power, keep these people from going back to Jerusalem, he builds these worship centers at the extreme ends of his kingdom. Now, here is the high place of Jeroboam, right there. I'll show you lots of pictures of it. This is the high place of Jeroboam, showing the headwaters of the Jordan. You see the Jordan headwaters right here. And what the people of Dan did, what the Israelites did, is they diverted the headwaters of the Dan stream all the way around the Tell to kind of form a water moat there, okay? The Tell, and I'll show you pictures of it here in a minute here. This is the picture of the whole thing. This whole Tell is about 50 acres. Now we are on what, 40 acres here? 37. 37 acres, okay. So this is a little bit bigger than Southwest property. Given the population density of towns at that time, the population density would mean that the city of Dan in this time would have had about 10,000 people living in it. So it's not a little backwater town. It's a pretty happening place for its day. I mean, because understand, cities weren't that big. Now then, I told you about the mud brick gate. There's the mud brick gate right there. And when we come in, that's probably the last thing, maybe the first thing we see or the last thing we see. We'll probably see it from the bus and not get off. But this is the main city gates into here. And well, I think I've got, yeah, there they are right there. Okay, the mud brick gate, the Iron Age gate, and then the high place of Jeroboam is off here. Okay, so those are the main three things. Now, what is just past the high place of Jeroboam? There's a thin, single, as I recall it, single wire strand fence. Single wire strand fence. If you go across that fence, at one point you're in Lebanon, and if you go across that fence at another point, you're in Syria. I mean, this is literally right on the border. Okay, last time I was there, the Lebanese were shooting rockets into here, but that was back in 2014. They're not doing that anymore. Mary would call me and say, "Now, where are those rockets with respect to where you've been?" They are where I was. Okay, all right. Anyway, okay, there's the aerial. This is a closer view of the high place where the golden calf was, the high place altar, and we're very certain that this is where it was. You can see where the sacrificial altar was, right there. You can see the podium. Now, this podium is where the temple to the golden calf would have been. The calf would have been right here in this area, and then back here are the temple rooms, and then the side chambers for the priests were over here. Okay, so that's what's left of it. There's a picture of it as you're walking up to it, and I'm going to show you lots of different aspects of it here in a few minutes. This is a picture looking up toward the high place itself. This is that big podium, the platform, where the golden calf would have been right above these stairs. And the altar was right here. Okay? So that's where those things were. Now, and there's another picture of it so you can see where the altar was and where the podium was. Another picture of the sacrificial altar, the podium, and the side chambers. And another picture, same thing. Now I want to show you some different stages of building here. I think the next slide is going to be an interesting one here for you. Notice these sides. Do you have any idea how big that altar was? You don't really get a sense of it, right? Now notice it's a metal frame. The reason it's a metal frame is because they had to reconstruct what the altar would have looked like because of one stone that they found. In excavating it, they found one horn of the altar. And they were able to estimate the sizes of the altar from a few things. One is the stairway beside the altar, right there. And another is this block wall right there. And so that kind of framed the area that the altar could have taken place. And the horn would have given them an idea of what the dimensions of the altar were. So that's why they came up with that. But there's what the altar size is. There's that guy's not short. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It looks like they gave them enough of, or he gave them enough of what the real temple looked like to make them feel comfortable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me ask you this. What kind of counterfeit bill is the most dangerous? The one that looks like the real thing. You go into a store with monopoly money, you're not going to fool anybody, right? But you go into the store with some money that looks like the real thing, feels like the real thing, and you might fool somebody, right? Isn't that the way that religious counterfeits work? The closer it looks like the real thing that you're comfortable with, the better, the more likely it is that you'll buy into it. And so that's what's going on. You're exactly right. That's what he's doing here. So anyway, there's the essential size. Now, when I was there in 2014, that altar framework was not there. So I don't know what it'll look like now. That's what it looks like when this picture was taken.
Now, when you said a horn,
Uh-huh.
you mean one of those horns?
Yeah, see, right here, see right here at the tip of the altar, that right there? One of the things that was common in altars was these horns. And the reason for the horns, you can see in the next picture, is if you remember, this is the tabernacle. The tabernacle on the Day of Atonement, the priest would take the blood of the bull that was slain and paint the horns of the altar with it. Okay, That's a part of what they did. It was a part of the requirements in the book of Leviticus. And so altars typically had horns on them. And occasionally in the Old Testament, you'll read about somebody who grabs hold of the horns of the altar. And the reason is because somebody's out to kill him. And he's thinking they won't kill him if he's hanging onto the altar. And so King Solomon, for example, says, go, fine, go, grab him, pull him off the altar, then kill him. And that's what he does.
And they found one of those horns.
They found one of the horns, and it's in the Israel Museum. Okay. So there are a lot of these things that they're able to reconstruct based on things that they've discovered archaeologically. All right. So, but now notice this. This is the law about altars. Remember, the tabernacle was built on a flat surface, right? It didn't have high places and low places and things like that. This is Exodus 20, verses 22 to 26. And the Lord said to Moses, thus you shall say to the people of Israel, you have seen for yourselves that I've talked with you from heaven. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. Strike one for Jeroboam, right? An altar of earth you shall make from me, and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. If you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you profane it. And you shall not go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness not be exposed to it. So the whole thing is no high places. Okay. So anyway, that's the way. Now, this is what a typical Israelite altar would have looked like. A stone altar. Notice it's rough stone. It's not decorated stone. Okay. And so that's what you're looking for in an altar. Well, that's not what Jeroboam gave these people. The high place of Jeroboam, this is another picture of it from the area where the golden calf would have been right there. Okay. And they know that because they found bases there, which would have been the bases on which it would have been mounted. This is another look looking at it. I got a lot of pictures of this. We'll just go through them. This is the priest's side rooms where the priest would have taken care of whatever priests do. The vestry, I guess you'd call it. Okay. Anyway, now then, notice this. Remember that part in Exodus about no dressed stone? Okay, you can see here, this would have been, these stones right here would probably have been the Canaanite stones, because this probably goes back to the days of Micah, Micah's prophet, who incidentally was the grandson of Moses. Check it out. And then this probably is a part of what Jeroboam did. And then this up here is what Ahab and Jeroboam II did right there. You can see different stages of construction. Okay. So notice when Jeroboam and Ahab get involved, they start decorating the stone. Okay. These are steps that were added by Ahab, which would be a 9th century BC. This is a basin that was added by the Hellenistic period, during the Hellenistic period, which would be the period between the Testaments. So it's obvious that this place was in use for centuries. These steps here were added by Jeroboam. These are the steps up to the high place. Now, there were steps before. Jeroboam built them out so that they're 8 meters long. And so that's Jeroboam II, not Jeroboam I. And again, you can see the different phases of construction here. The undressed stones, the dressed stones from Jeroboam I, and the dressed stones from Jeroboam II and Ahab. Priestly chambers. Okay, this is the way Dan looks. Remember the Canaanite gate around 2000 BC. That's what we'll see there. And then the golden calf altar right there is what we've been looking at. And then there are the 3 Israelite gates where you enter into the city. This is where we'll actually go into the city in order to head up toward the high place. And this is the way the high place dressed out. The original altar would have occupied this space right here. Probably was built up during the days of Ahab, but it occupied that space all along. Ahab added these stairs going up to the altar. Jeroboam II, who follows Ahab, added enlarged the steps up to the high place. And then you've got the Hellenistic wall right there that falls within the intertestamental period. This is the layout of the gates where you enter. See the bus there? Okay, that bus is right there by where we'll enter. There's a little gate right there. No, not that one. That one right there. We'll enter that gate and we'll come down here and go through these the gates into the city. Now those are fascinating. The gates into the city. There's what the marketplace and Iron Age gate looks like. Iron Age is Israelite period. The Bronze Age is Abraham period. Iron Age is Israelite period. There's the gate, courtyard into the gate, the marketplace near the gate. This is the most fascinating discovery. 1993, they found this stone. It's called the Victory Stella of Hazel. And this is where Hazel, king of Syria, boasts about whipping up on the Israelites. And what he says right here is that he defeated the house of David. Right there, you've got Beth David. Beth is house, David is David. And that is that's the first archaeological evidence ever discovered that confirms the historicity of David, the king of Israel. Up till then, everybody's saying David was just like King Arthur. Just kind of a legend, He didn't really exist. Then they found that, and guess what? They had to rethink. Then some people came and said, well, that's a forgery. No, it's not a forgery. Here's how I know it's not a forgery. Because, see, it's in 3 pieces. They found this piece one year, and in the same general location, they found these other 2 pieces the next year. Not a forgery. They found the 3 pieces. They fit together. They're going, oh. Okay. What was the name of that stone? The Victory Stella, S-T-E-L-E, of Hazel. Sometimes they call it the Tel Dan Stella. S-T-E-L-E is a stone monument. That's what it is. And so this is where the kings back then, whenever they had a particularly good day, they'd write a story about it, have it carved in stone. And that's what he did there. Okay. This is where it was located. And if you back up just a little bit, this in the area in the foreground is where that stone was found. And this is the walls going into the Iron Age gate. Now, remember I told you about the discovery of the stone in Caesarea that identified Pontius Pilate. Remember that? Okay. And remember I told you they found it in a secondary use, right? A lot of times what happens over here, nobody was particularly interested in Pontius Pilate when they're doing some renovation work in Caesarea. So they find this rock that refers to Pontius Pilate, and they just chop it down to use it for something else. And so later on, archaeologists come along and they find it, and they go, oh, wow, this refers to Pontius Pilate. But whoever moved it didn't really think enough about it to, they weren't looking at it for historical value. They didn't care about Pilate. Same thing here. The Israelites, by the time they rebuild this city wall, they're not interested in Hazel. That's old news. So they take that rock and they use it in building their marketplace. And it's not until the archaeologists come along and they find that rock in secondary use that they realize what it is.
When did they start digging for all this historical?
They've been digging in Dan since 1970. So different places at different times, but Dan since 1970. Okay, now then, these are the walls they've reconstructed. Now these are fascinating, and you'll see these in various locations in Israel. Notice these stones right here. They don't look like they're in a normal position. They're called standing stones. Nobody's entirely sure what they are, but they're all over the place. There's 5 of them right there at the city gate. 5 of them right there. They're not part of the wall. There's 5 stones in front. Now, Some people think that those depict Canaanite gods. Maybe they do. Some people think those are monuments to prominent people who have passed on. Maybe they are. Because of the location of some of them, they seem to have some cultic or ceremonial significance, and it looks like the kind of thing that somebody might use to swear by. Like in court, I'll show you in a minute one of them. Like in court, you know, in the old days, now we don't do it anymore, but you used to have a Bible. You put your hand on the Bible and swear, you know, that sort of thing, okay? But this is standing stones near the outer gate, and there's another picture of those 5 standing stones. You'll see them when we go there. Sometimes you'll see them in places like this, where there's like a shrine. And those stones, they meant something to those people. We don't know what they meant, but we know they had some kind of cultic significance, okay? This is the threshold of the outer gate. You'll see this as you go through these gates. You'll see the places like that threshold right there, you know, that identify where the outside is and where the inside is. The outer gate, and if you come into the outer gate, notice this right here. Notice that pedestal right there. We have several pictures of it. This is as you come in the city gate, and there's Old Testament references to the king. David, for example, when David's getting old and the generals come to him and say, look, we can either fight the enemies or we can protect you, but we can't do both. And you're too old to go out with us anymore anyway, so you stay back. This is after he already stayed back once he got in trouble. But then he would take a position by the city gate so that all the army would pass by him. That is the kind of thing you would have at this particular location. So that pedestal right there serves some ceremonial purpose. If you look at it there, you see the standing stone. See the standing stone there? Okay, what is that for? Well, there's speculation. Notice there's some bases here, some decorative bases here. See those? Okay, those had a function. What was the function? There's another picture of it. Another picture of it. Close up. And this is probably what it was. Those bases formed a structure for a canopy to protect whoever's there. Well, who's there? Could be the king. Could be a judge. Could be somebody exercising some kind of judicial function. And that stone might have been the stone by which they swore to tell the truth, something like that. It's speculation. We don't know what it was. Had some cultic significance, had some relationship to idolatry, but we don't know precisely what it was. Okay? So there's a lot of this stuff that we have to kind of figure out. These are chambers inside the gate. Another view of those. And this is another socket stone for another pedestal area. Paved Street. The people of Dan used cobblestones to pave their roads. It was quite a nice system there. They looked very nice. This is the gate fortifications that they used. A lot of times what they would do in these cities, and we saw this with the city of David. We talked about that. City of David, where they pile up a bunch of stones so an army can't just walk in. There's some protection there. So that's fortifications at the gate. There's the upper gate podium, similar to the one I showed you at the outer gate, right there. Now, the thing that just occurs to me, you might think about when you think about these city gates and the place there where the judicial functions are taking place. Do you remember in the book of Ruth how when Boaz goes to initiate legal proceedings against the other possible, kinsman redeemer, the other possible kinsman redeemer? Remember that? And they go to the city gate, right? That's where this stuff took place. So that's probably what you're looking at here. Some place where judicial functions took place out in public. Just like today, courts are supposed to be available so people can walk in, see what's happening, right? Okay. Works out well when you don't have COVID. There's the upper gate. And so that's basically what we're going to see at Dan. All right, any thoughts about that? Yeah, Jim?
You said 10,000 people lived in that little area?
That little 50, yeah, because remember, they didn't have big yards like we do. In fact, I wish we were going to go to Chorazin because I love Chorazin. We're going to Bethsaida, but we're not going to Chorazin. But in Chorazin, it's really neat to see the way these cities were built. Though literally, you could not get a fire marshal to sign off on the way that those things were built. Two people would have to walk sideways to pass each other on the streets of some of these cities. And they're built with black basalt stone, and they don't have street lamps. So it gives a whole new meaning to thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. If you're walking in a city where all the walls are black and it's a new moon, you're going to stub your toe, right? And so thy word is a lamp unto my feet. They say that what they would do is they put lamps on the toe of their sandals so that as they walked along, they could keep from bumping into things. Okay? All right. Yeah, you don't want to walk too fast because that oil might splash out on you and burn you. Okay. Anyway, anything else? Thank you so much. Next week is going to be my favorite place, Caesarea Philippi. We'll see you then.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Dale. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I can't figure that. What am I doing?
Dale, on day 4, we're going to see quite a few places, not just one.
Each of those days we'll see all